In life, it's hard to think of a resource more valuable than your time. Most people don't have as much free time to try and enjoy games as much as they'd like. Most have much less than myself and my content creator friends do. And one of the things that frustrates me the most is feeling like my time is being wasted. And because of the nature of the raid system in Escape from Tarkov, the all-or-nothing punishing aspect of death, the more time we get in a raid, experiencing the parts of the game that most of us love, the better. Every minute spent outside of raids is like waiting in line for a roller coaster. Do you ever spend like your entire afternoon at a theme park just to realize at the end that you waited in line for like 3 or 4 rides, each of which lasted like 45 seconds? You spent the whole day at the park where all you wanted to do was ride some rides, and you really only ended up with a few minutes of actual content that you wanted. Now, in the case of a theme park, it's kind of understandable to some degree, as there's limited seats on the ride, there's limited rides, and there's lots of folks waiting to hop on each. Now, I find myself feeling the same sort of annoyance very often when playing Tarkov. And due to the nature of game, this is amplified when, I'm already having a rough time in my raids, although in Tarkov's case, this is for less understandable reasons. Now, don't mistake what I'm saying here. I'm not asking for the experience to be made softer, less hardcore, more casual. I don't want the roller coaster that is Tarkov to go easier on me, to not be as fast or intense. I just want to reduce the amount of time that we all have to wait before we get back on to experience it again. For some time now, I've felt pretty strongly, and have tried to varying degrees of success, to advocate that some of the biggest quality of life improvements that Tarkov community would benefit from are also the ones that nobody ever talks about. They're not sexy, they're not exciting, but they are crucial to the experience that we feel when playing the game. I'm talking about the time spent before and after raids, outside of combat and survival. The stash, the hideout, the flea market, the traders. These are all places that I bet you either want to spend as little time as possible in because you either want to get back to raiding, or there's somewhere where you actually find a lot of enjoyment in, and you would also benefit significantly if they received some thoughtful design attention. Now, this video serves as the first I'll be making in a potential series about my fairly in-depth proposals for UI and UX improvements for Tarkov. My hopes for future episodes of this series are to get into some of the history around many of the features and design decisions that exist inside of Escape from Tarkov, why they are the way they are, what was the original reasoning for them being added to the game as they are now, and then provide some constructive feedback about how they could potentially be improved. My hope here is to try to be as valuable as I can for the developers, providing additional ideas and perspective that they might not have considered, and also to help the community understand the how, what, and why behind the process of designing features and software. Depending on how this video is received, the feedback I get, and what, if anything, happens as a result, I have tons more ideas to do many more videos like this. Once you're done with the video, let me know what you think, and if you like my thoughts, spread this video and the ideas around the community. Now let's start with a quick example of a simple feature that I think stands to benefit massively from a little bit of UX love, something I personally find myself spending considerable amounts of time doing, and that's selling the various items and gear that I've got in my stash. Now, of course, everyone has their own workflow, your mileage may vary, but my process when it comes to selling an item is as follows. First, I need to know if the item is worth selling on the flea market or not. The only way to really go about this is to first check with the traders to see if any of them are willing to buy the item, and who is going to pay me the most. Now, although the more you play, the easier it becomes to know which trader is going to give you the most value for certain types of items, sometimes you want to be sure. Requiring navigation to the trader menu and going through all of the different traders one by one, keeping mental notes of what they're willing to pay. Now, once you have that number in mind, you can then either go to the market and search for the item, which usually involves clearing all sorts of filters and other annoyingness with the UI, or do the more efficient but still quite awkward process of finding the item, right-clicking and selecting filtered search. Now, it's quite common for folks to want to list their items at some price slightly below the cheapest currently on the market to maximize their chances of a quick sale. So you can compare these prices with what the trader was willing to offer you for that item, assuming you haven't forgotten by now. But of course, the sale price is only half the story. You need to account for the listing fee, which you don't know. Now, if you want to see how much this is going to be, you then need to click the button over here to list the item, click over here and type in the price that you're looking for, and then you can see what the listing fee is going to be. Now, assuming you remember which trader is going to give you how much and how much they're going to be, then you can kind of do the math in your head to subtract the fee from the sale price, and now you can finally determine where you want to sell the item to get the most amount of money. Now, of course, if at this point you decide that the trader is either going to give you the most amount of money or the difference isn't significant enough, so maybe you'd much rather get like the trader rep or something like that, you then need to go all the way back to the trader menu to do that. Now, this experience isn't exactly the most difficult in the world. I mean, we've all been doing it for a long time now, but holy hell, you can't really call it streamlined, intuitive, or user-friendly, can you? Now, let me propose an experience I'll refer to as the quick sell feature. Imagine you're in your stash and you right-click any sellable item and choose the sell option. This should bring up a dialog that lists all of the prices that each trader who's willing to buy it from you will pay for it, as well as giving you the option for selling it on the flea market. The price here would be automatically populated with some price that's less than the current cheapest price on the market, with the fee and final price displayed as well. Now this way, with only a couple of clicks, you can compare at a glance all of the options available to you, decide which is the best, and with only one or two more clicks, commit to whichever option you chose. Now compare this process to what I described before, going back and forth between all of the traders, into the flea market, back to the traders. Don't you think that this feature I just described would be something that you would use often? Have to mention too that I would want to include the select similar items feature that the flea market already has right now, so that batch selling multiple items can benefit from this streamlined process as well. Now there's tons of use cases where this might not be 100% what you'd want to do all the time. Maybe the item you want to list is much rarer and has a smaller supply on the market, so you're able to price it more strategically, or perhaps you really want to undercut the market a ton to sell much faster. These options are still available to you in the same way they work today. Nothing outside of this feature should change here, but if you have a particular price in mind, then you can actually type it in directly here to quickly compare this price and fee with the trader offerings. Again, this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but if there's one thing I've learned from my years of doing UI and UX design, usually one-size-fits-all solutions means sacrificing the experience for the majority. Now what this design does is create a user-friendly feature that allows most people to get the most value when selling most of their stuff in the easiest and quickest way possible, without changing the existing experience in any way for anybody else. You also can't ignore that making the selling experience easier and more streamlined will likely increase the supply of items for sale at any given time, as it's less cumbersome and annoying to do, which will actually benefit buyers as well because there's going to be more supply available for sale rather than simply sitting dormant in people's stashes. As we can see, this design is flexible enough to handle all of the use cases I mentioned while still being easy to understand and easy to use. Nothing in this design is a major paradigm shift in terms of functionality or look. It doesn't include any new data that the game client doesn't already have. It simply presents the same information and options to players in a way that actually makes sense. Most of the major features in the game have very similar ways in which they can be improved for the vast majority of people without sacrificing the experience for anyone else who may or may not use them for whatever reason. Now again, if you guys want me to dive into more and BSG is willing to listen, I've got lots more like these I can do in the future. Now that we've got a taste for a relatively simple feature proposal, let's hop into my proposal for the full player preset system. Let's start with what it is. A full player preset is the naming and saving of a full gear loadout configuration that you can quickly load in the future. Now while it's conceptually similar to the weapon preset system, the hope is that in experience and implementation, it's going to be very different and hopefully a drastic improvement by comparison. So, what are one of these loadouts going to consist of? I think it makes the most sense to define it as all of the gear that you have with you that can be lost upon death, including other useful things like hotkeyed medical items, grenades in your pockets, magazines and rigs filled with the desired ammo, and even cosmetic items. Now note that this doesn't include anything in your character's protected slots, i.e. your protector case and its contents, the compass, or melee weapon. Now to explain why, let me outline some of the requirements I started with and the major considerations that came to mind during this design process. What I want to do here is introduce as few new screens and UI elements as possible. Similar to the quick sell feature I discussed before, I want to design something that streamlines the most common use case for the biggest impact for the most amount of people, while still allowing the same functionality that people are used to today. The ultimate goal here is to get you back into raids as fast as possible, to keep you immersed in the gameplay and maximize your time raiding. The most common use case for this feature is getting into a raid after you've died, the time where we typically have to go through the process of building the kit we want. Now let's briefly go through the process as it exists today to see how long it typically takes for an average player to gear up, how many clicks it consists of, that sort of thing. Alright, so that was a recording I pulled from earlier today when I did a raid. Wasn't trying to be particularly fast, just sort of the average gear up time. Now, the double clicks I did to open up cases and containers and stuff like that, I actually counted as single clicks. Now, although I managed to survive slightly longer than it took me to get geared up for this raid, at least one PMC that I fought wasn't so lucky. And if you take into consideration the time I spent waiting in the queue, I spent almost twice as much time outside of the raid as I did inside of the raid. The UX designer in me feels like it's kind of rough in my opinion, but let's continue. Most kits that you're going to use are going to be a combination of things that you already have, as well as stuff that you typically buy from traders and or the flea market. So this feature should be flexible enough to take those sources of gear into consideration. The weapon preset system as it exists today does this, but honestly it's quite clumsy and error prone, so we should try to avoid the same pitfalls. We want to reduce the risk of implementing this feature by limiting as much as possible how complicated it gets in terms of logic or edge cases. Many of the weird and annoying behavior that exists today with features like weapon presets or insurance returns are due to the fact that they often attempt to automatically move or place items from one place into your inventory. And because there's an infinite number of ways in which a player's stashes and gear can be laid out, this game of Tetris is actually an extremely difficult one to handle by software in most cases, and often impossible. Now, this leads to all sorts of issues like being unable to collect all of your insurance at once and having to come back later because there's not enough space, or being able to assemble a preset because although the gun and the individual parts all fit, together they form a shape and size of an object that just doesn't fit in your stash. So with this in mind, one of the requirements that I had was to avoid this problem entirely by never putting anything in your stash directly. So let's take a look at the main use case here of getting back into a raid after you die. I think it's safe to say at this point that a requirement for using this feature is that your PMC has nothing equipped outside of those protected item slots I mentioned before. Now in this situation, that restriction isn't an issue at all, it's the default state. Even if you want to switch maps or something, all you need to do is swap out your docks case or keybar or do something that an automated system wouldn't be able to do anyway automatically. It's something that you have to do yourself. Okay, but what about if you didn't die but you want to use this system? You want to swap out what you have right now for a totally different saved loadout. Honestly, I don't think it's too much to ask that the player takes the gear off the PMC themselves, which can be done quickly by just control-clicking everything over if you have space, or more meticulously if you have everything sorted and organized. This is still far less work than switching up kits today. You still have the option to do exactly that, and we don't ever have to worry about the game automatically trying to ungear your PMC with some terrible, buggy algorithm that can't elegantly handle when there's not enough free space in your stash. We want the creation of presets to be easy and intuitive, and want making changes to those presets to be the same thing. By defining the player preset as all of your gear and hotkeyed items except for your protected slots, this means that this UI right here is actually all we really need. We already have all the elements in place, so why not piggyback on this and limit the amount of new UI that we need to create, test, and maintain? Let's add a button over here that allows us to save the current loadout as a preset. At this point, all we really need to do is allow the person to name it, and they're pretty much done. The rest is handled automatically under the covers. So a noteworthy limitation of this design is that it requires you to have everything already, which is different than the weapon preset system, which allows you to put together builds that you might not be able to afford, or maybe you don't own all the pieces for. Now, I personally don't see this as a major issue with this design, perhaps because I see it conceptually different. Most players know what loadouts they like to use most of the time, and as it stands today, they need to go and buy and build these loadouts every single raid anyway. So what the system aims to do is not necessarily replace the current process of getting geared up. If you want to continue to do it every time like you do today, by all means, I don't want to change that. If you want to run 1,000 raids with your favorite 4 gear sets, you only need to gear up 4 times, saving each as a preset, and then the other 996 times you can get into raids without all of the other bullshit in the way. Now, if that doesn't sound like value to you, I'm actually surprised you've watched this far into the video. Now, given that there's potentially a lot of data here for any given loadout, all of the items and slots and attachments and everything that they're connected to being these massive trees of data, perhaps for performance and stability purposes, when this is done at first, we limit each player to something like, 5 or 10 presets. That's up to Battlestate to figure out, but we should build it in such a way that this number is dynamic for different players. That way, we could initially test out the adoption of the system, iron out any performance issues, any bugs, and then scale appropriately without needing to worry about a massive dump of 1 million preset trees bogging down the database or servers all at once. Then later, we can build more functionality into it as we gain confidence in the system. We could use this as a foundation to tie the number of presets you have to something like the player level or trader loyalty level, or even make additional slots quest rewards. Another idea is that this feature could be directly integrated with quests. Maybe active quests could add a pre-built preset into a different section of the list. It could challenge you to accomplish certain tasks wearing specific gear, ammo, and meds, while still giving you flexibility of taking what you want with you in terms of keys and other stuff in your protector case. The sky's really the limit here. Hell, the traders could even offer you these full presets that you need for quests at a discount, making repeated attempts at these quests less annoying. Now, the ability to make changes to existing presets is an interesting challenge, because you might not have the gear that you need for the preset that you want to edit. So if you want to keep all the items in a given preset except for like one or two, then you're essentially going to need to make that kit yourself and then overwrite the existing preset using the same name. Now, of course, it'd be fantastic to have the ability to make all sorts of minor specific tweaks here and there, but seeing as how this isn't going to be a super common thing, making an entirely new UI and all of the complexity that comes along with it doesn't seem to be worth it right now. Honestly, in my opinion, the use case that makes the most amount of sense is going to be that presets are going to last you maybe a couple hours or something. If you want to do 5 or 10 runs in a row, it saves you the time of having to build that loadout every single time. But tomorrow, you might load up the game and delete all your presets and start with something else you feel like. Now, this implementation also works for partial presets, loadouts in which you don't define everything, but maybe only partial things that you're going to use common amongst different kits. Maybe you always find yourself running the same armor, headphones, and backpack and rig, but want to mix up the guns or ammo you run. All you need to do is fill up those slots, save the preset, and voila, you're good to go. All you need to do is load up the preset, and then choose the gun and ammo that you want. It gets you like 98% of the way there with not a whole lot of extra work. Alright, so now that I've shown how easy and flexible creating the player preset can be, let's look at the process of using them once they're set up. On your character screen near the Save Loadout button I showed before, there's an Equip Loadout button. Now this button is going to be enabled under two conditions. First, if you have loadouts saved, and second, if your character doesn't have any items equipped in any of the slots other than the protected slots as outlined before. Now if you hover over the button when it's disabled, it should give you some context telling you why it's disabled so that you can fix it. Now, if the button is enabled and you press it, a familiar dialog could be shown that lists all of the saved presets, as well as including a text box to allow you to type and filter if you have a decently sized list of presets and want to find a specific one as fast as possible. Now, selecting an option and pressing open brings us to the final step, and admittedly, the most challenging one. Now, there's a couple different design strategies we can go with here. The first being the one that's the easiest to implement by the developers, but makes what has the potential to be an amazing feature probably quite annoying to use in many cases, some amount of time, and the second being the one that's more complicated to design, involves a little bit more engineering, but it's far and away a much better solution, experience, and honestly, really the dream. Again, the details about how this is built and all that stuff isn't up to me, I just want to talk about some of the options and considerations that we can all think about. So let's get the first out of the way, which is basically co-opting the existing flea market browse filter feature, which would admittedly suffer from all of the same issues as the weapon preset system today. The most common issue is that any items that are for sale by other players can be purchased by someone else between the time that it's listed at an option and the time that you click Purchase All, which has the potential to cause the entire transaction to fail. By the time the list reloads and you go through ensuring that all of the prices are acceptable again and you hit Purchase, it happens all over again. You're essentially forced to spam hitting F5 and then click and then confirm without actually giving enough time to make sure you're not getting scammed by ridiculously overpriced flea market items. So a few other issues that are worth mentioning is that the fact that this list doesn't include the items you already own, which would otherwise give you important context about the entire preset as a whole. A bunch of bugs exist that prevents items that should be available from traders to not be available for some reason in this UI. And the more complex items like guns and the complex tree of attachments that they come with are bought with parts that might be extra or unwanted. The feature as it exists today breaks one of the rules I set forth in the start, in that it involves the possibility of buying items and moving them into your stash, something I wanted to avoid. Now, using this as it is could be done with a bit of tweaking, and there are a few awkward use cases that make it a bit weird, but it's at least an option to keep in mind. Now, as I mentioned, the second option is more complicated and could be done a bunch of different ways to successfully meet what I'm going to outline as the ultimate success criteria. These things, more than anything, are what matters for this feature to be the best it can be. First, the kit should be automatically assembled with all of the gear from all the different sources I mentioned. It should prioritize existing gear you already have, and the remaining items should come from traders and the flea market, prioritizing the most affordable options. The purchase, assembly, and equipping of all this gear from different sources should happen in a single transaction and without the potential for any race conditions, errors, or any other issues getting in the way. This feature would be a success in my opinion if once the preset was selected, you're given the option to review the total price, that once you decide to do so, with a single button press, your character is now ready to go. Now, one such way of achieving this that I thought of would be the addition of a new backend feature that I'll call the shopping cart. Now, when you commit to having this preset assembled, what you'd be doing is effectively taking the cheapest current version of every item that you need to buy from the flea market off the market, temporarily reserving it, let's say for 30 seconds. Now, this gives you the ability to look over everything to ensure that you're not getting hit with some crazy overpriced listing that you didn't expect before finally committing to the transaction, at which point there would be no cases where the transaction should fail. You're no longer in a race against anybody else to click buy. Now, if you wait longer than the 30 seconds, if you go to purchase, then yeah, sure, you'll get hit with an error. But otherwise, once the transaction is complete, the system should automatically assemble everything as outlined in your preset, and your character should be fully loaded with everything ready to go. It's always necessary to pay careful attention when you build features like this, as any API that affects the availability of items on a flea market has a potential to be abused. So they're probably going to want to do smart protections like rate limits or even CAPTCHAs to prevent this from becoming a problem. We should be thinking about this feature as a service, perhaps as if we're paying Skier to source, purchase, and gather all of these desired items for us. With this in mind, once you choose a preset and commit to wanting to build it, this should be similar to having him go off and begin to do his thing, something that he would be quite angry at you for telling him never mind partway through. Perhaps attaching a non-refundable 50% deposit on every flea market item in your build might work. You'd lose the deposit if you cancel the transaction without building the preset, with the item being relisted and maybe 25% going to the seller and 25% going to Skier. But if you continue with the purchase, your deposit is going to be applied to the total transaction. Of course, we're going to want to design this in such a way that prevents people from accidentally losing deposits or losing them because of any other issues with the design, like maybe the only options that were available to them were ridiculously overpriced and they don't want to or can't afford to pay. I have lots of other ideas about not only other challenges they'd face building this feature, but also tons of ideas on how to creatively solve them. If Nikita shows interest in building these features similar to how I've outlined, I'd be happy to share these thoughts with them and the devs, but I don't really see much reason in getting into all of the nitty-gritty of that right now. Now, before we finish up, I want to suggest one more set of related changes that would be amazing as well, and that's the flow of getting into a raid once you're geared up. This is another example of something that most people do the exact same way thousands and thousands of times over and over and over again, with no difference. If there's something that the majority of people do basically every time without difference, then I see no reason to make that process automatic, the default, not requiring them to do those things every time, but instead put the onus of the extra clicks and everything on the folks who are taking part in whatever the edge cases are going to be. 99% of the raids that I go into, I want to be fully healed, fully hydrated, energized, I want my armor to be repaired, and I want to have all of my gear insured. Most people like me hit insure all simply because it's easy and convenient. It costs next to nothing for this types of stuff that you're protecting anyway in the long run, and even the stuff that you'd think you'd not want to insure, like melee weapons or key bars that you keep in your gamma container, can be accidentally discarded in raids, so all the more reason to always insure everything all the time. Now, post-raid healing as it exists today is a little bit backwards if you think about it, considering that our characters regain their different health values while we're between raids due to skills and hideout upgrades. So if we always heal right after we die, we're not actually benefiting from this. There's going to be some time between raids. I'd much rather have my PMC heal automatically, and then if there's any resources left to be replenished as I'm about to go into a raid, I can deal with it then, when it's smaller and less expensive. Now, removing it from the post-raid process, separating it from the combat information that we get today would be super useful, and placing it in the pre-raid flow, to me, makes a lot more sense. So again, assuming the vast majority of the time most of us are going to want to fully repair, heal, and insure, we can combine this into a single screen where we can take care of all the pre-raid preparations at once. And then we can also allow for some customization or less common behaviors like partial insurance, with buttons that let us access the existing screens we have today that we already have to press buttons to get to anyway. And also, we could have this feature remember our choices, so if you happen to have slightly different preferences or behaviors, the new flow will still benefit you. Maybe you want to always heal and always repair, but not always insure. That would work as well. This single screen could replace a handful of other screens, bringing most commonly used features into the foreground and putting less used features out of the way while still being accessible. This new design gives us some cool new potential opportunities as well, like maybe giving warning to players who may be about to insure their gear when entering labs, for example. Lots of folks still don't know that even though you're able to insure your gear on your way into labs like every other map, that you'll never actually get it back if you die because of the lore of the labs location being inaccessible. I want to use this opportunity at the end here to talk a little bit about some thoughts and feelings I'd love for the community to consider. Now, the more I learn about Nikita's vision for the game, the things he wants, what his priorities are, what limitations the dev team is facing, the more I feel compelled to put together videos like this to try to be a point of reference, a collection of ideas from the perspective of the player, giving them something of value that they can keep in mind, they can listen to some, all, or even none of it. These videos aren't demands, they aren't just something I send to Nikita and my bidding is done, they aren't just there to make my life easier, to appease my content creator friends, to suck up to the devs, or whatever other nonsense that I hear all the time. As much as the community loves to pick on streamers for ruining their game, and whether you like me or not, all I ask is that you put aside whatever personal biases you have against me or the devs and consider the ideas that we share based on the merit. The ideas should stand on their own. If you don't like these ideas, consider honestly that if it came from somebody else, if you have a different perspective. The ideas that I propose, and have always proposed, contrary to what the loudest contingent in the community thinks, are aimed at improving the game for everyone. Not myself, not just full-time streamers, not just casuals, not tryhards. It's for the benefit of all of the players and their intended experience that I've learned from Nikita himself. Now, not only that, but my recommendations and ideas almost always consider the engineering challenges and trade-offs in the process, something honestly you'll struggle to find in any random Reddit post, theory crafting video from other content creators, or angry rant on Twitter tagging BSG. The experience of the game, things like navigating the menus, preparing yourself between raids, navigating the market, the hideout, making these experiences more user-friendly, thoughtful, and streamlined are going to make the game less annoying, buggy, and confusing, and that's a good thing. The hardcore combat survival experience stops when you open up a settings menu and want to toggle a feature on or change a settings slider. There shouldn't be any RNG or punishment when trying to navigate confusing UI. You shouldn't be scared to navigate to the market in fear of accidentally losing something extremely valuable because of a misclick or a poorly placed button without a confirmation dialog. You shouldn't be able to easily get scammed out of your money because of hidden or misleading information on a listing. Now, while the onus is on the developers to make these experiences as efficient and reliable as possible, I fully believe those of us who are paying attention, those of us who care for the future of the game and who have good ideas that they want to share, should help as much as we can in funneling these ideas to them in a productive way. Thank you guys a ton for sticking around this long. I really do appreciate you letting me be honest and real with you. I appreciate so much the positivity, the messages of encouragement, and everything that comes with it. As much as you guys tell me how much of a difference my content makes for you, all of your positivity and encouragement makes a difference to me. I really do appreciate every one of you guys. Hope you and yours all stay safe and healthy, and I hope to see you soon.